Hey y'all, it's Jennifer with Between Sessions. Today we're looking at the intersection of grief and childhood emotional neglect. And while grief is something that every human experiences, if you grew up with childhood emotional neglect, grief can feel especially overwhelming. Today we're looking at what this is and why it is so hard and what you can do to move through it in a healthy way. So it's impossible to move through life without experiencing loss, of course, whether it's the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or a major life transition. Grief really will touch all of us. It's universal, but the emotional skills and how to deal with it are not. So imagine if you're standing in an ocean where, without ever having learned how to swim. The waves would feel really powerful, unpredictable, and maybe even pretty terrifying. And this is what grief can feel like, especially when you don't have the emotional tools to manage it. So, with childhood emotional neglect, this happens when caregivers are consistently failing to notice, respond to, or validate a child's emotions. And you may have been provided for physically with a house and food, shelter, water, clothing, but emotionally, something important was missing. So, when your emotions weren't acknowledged growing up, you may have learned to disconnect from them. So, as an adult, this can make it really hard to identify what you're actually feeling or even to believe that your emotions matter. They feel insignificant, or sometimes they're even hard to just place what is happening inside. So, the psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced the 5 stages of grief. Some you may know, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. So these stages aren't linear. They are more like a map than they help us understand our experience, but you can shift between these emotions over a course of a period of time, or have some like at the same time, really. So for denial, that can include a phrase such as, "This can't be happening." Denial protects us from shock. But if you grew up emotionally neglected, denying feelings may already be your default setting. This can make it especially hard to move forward in grief. The next one, anger. It's protective and energizing, but if you've experienced childhood emotional neglect, you were never taught how to express anger safely. So instead, anger typically turns inward as self-criticism or shame. The third one, bargaining. If only and what if, it's the mind's attempt to regain some sense of control, and you might replay scenarios or carry guilt. So for those who already take on too much responsibility, this stage can feel especially heavy. And the fourth one is depression. So that deep sadness, the vulnerability is high, and when the truth settles in, the deep sadness often follows. So if emotions are walled off and the support is avoided, grief can linger here and become pretty prolonged, and that's when we see some depressive episodes experienced. The final one is acceptance and acknowledging the reality. It doesn't mean that you are okay with the loss, but it means that you acknowledge it and the shock softens and you begin to consider what comes next. So how emotional neglect blocks grief is that it makes it harder to go through. It really allows you to avoid the feelings, struggle with anger, isolate yourself, and become more vulnerable to depression. And this is what I see often in my practice, where even though you really need support and to begin to deal with the tough feelings, it feels like it's easier just to shut off and wall off all the feelings. So healing through grief, what we can do is we don't have to dive into all the emotions at once. We have to start small, check in with yourself a few times a day, reach out to someone that you consider safe, and even think about working with a therapist to build the emotional skills. Healing emotional neglect is something that you can do to help you learn to feel again, not just about grief, but joy, love, connection. When you build emotional awareness, the grief becomes more manageable. And the final thought here is you don't have to do this alone. Grief hurts, and that's because you loving someone, it lets you know that you mattered, that loving someone mattered. And while it could feel overwhelming, you're not broken, you're not alone. So with support and emotional skills, you can learn how to move through loss in a healthier, more compassionate way. So be well today and take care.